on Twitter. Not so fast. You probably got a tag.
Just checking that now. Yeah, here we go. Retweeted.
Awesome. Thank you.
So me and Christian will probably go back and forth between and turn our cameras on and off, just to save bandwidth.
Okay.
Christian, do you want to start with yours on so you can intro?
Yeah, I'll switch it.
Okay.
Let's give people like a minute. Give people a minute to get in here.
I shared the link in a couple private rooms too.
Cool. All right. We got like 20 people in. I think we can start.
Sounds good.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another POV Crypto live stream. This time with someone that I've been following personally since I got into crypto. I think you're like one of my first 25 follows on Twitter. So it's exciting to have the man, the myth, the legend, Not So Fast on the podcast.
You paint me in a very friendly light. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, man. I'm glad to get down to brass tacks on talking about Bitcoin and crypto and what it all means in present day.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's just start off for our audience that's not familiar with you. Who's Not So Fast and why do you have 145,000 followers?
Well, that second question I have no idea the answer to, but the first question is I'm a pseudonymous person in the Bitcoin and crypto space, and I started off mining. I started off as a non-starter, as a lot of people do. I read about Bitcoin on the Boing Boing blog at around 2011, and it's very like kind of San Francisco, California type bent, and there was a lot of skepticism about it, because of course it was all poo-pooing the libertarian ideals behind it. And so, of course, it was never going to work. And so I thought, yeah, I know these people are the smartest people that I read at the time for the time being. And so I kind of ignored it and realized, like, yeah, libertarianism's not a super easy to swallow philosophy for a lot of people. Otherwise, it would be much more popular than it is. So I left it alone for a while. And then kind of heard about the markets pumping in 2013. And then right at the end of 2013, I saw Dogecoin, I think on some kind of meme somewhere, and realized, okay, this with Bitcoin's finances could catch on a lot. And in a way, it was right, because it caught me and it caught a lot of other people that started around the same time, that I kind of termed the Dogecoin cohort, though I don't know anybody else who calls it that. But it was enough to bring people into Bitcoin, and some of them stayed in the altcoin world, and some of them dropped out, and some of them became probably hardcore Bitcoiners. Some of them became traders and miners and everything else. So I started off mining Dogecoin, and then kind of became the most prominent hobbyist miner, because I was live tweeting profitability of spec mining newly launched altcoins. But I had an overarching interest in Bitcoin and everything else. And I was testing the theory, like, are altcoins just a vehicle to get more Bitcoin, or is there potential for like similar long-term value? Like, how does this all work? And this is all before like discussion of stock to flow and, writing long form medium articles and having reputable journalists into reporting on cryptocurrency regularly, more than just seeming like a silly rag. So the thesis was to, participate pseudonymously, but be a good actor in the space for as long as possible. So like me, the human behind the handle, screws up all the time, but I wanted my handle to be like, okay, I'm going to be a good actor as part of my involvement in the space, because if it's so young, if people follow what I do and my good example and be a good actor as well, then we'll have more good people than we would otherwise. And if I just get in here and not really care about stuff and, scam people if I feel like it, it's really not going to elevate it anywhere beyond that. So I guess the combination of those things all together have helped me try to keep a fairly objective eye on everything that's going around, even though the space has gotten way too complex for me to be an expert on uh, even one small area. And I've even kind of obsolesced out of mining because I wanted to do it at a hobbyist level, and that's all but done at this point. But I still try to stay involved with sort of the zeitgeist and the narratives going on, and know kind of what the trading structure is, know who is driving things, and trying to stay out of groupthink and have the good conversations and the hard conversations and challenge my own viewpoints so that we I can with a clear conscience and clear eyes and a full heart, keep shilling Bitcoin and crypto to whoever might be interested in what it could offer.
Okay, that's awesome intro, and yeah, kind of thanks for getting into even your motivations of intent behind the not so fast pseudonym. I guess my question for you is, I guess there's a lot of things I'd like to unpack there, right? Like first and
Yeah.
foremost, like the Dogecoin cohort. Like I'm so personally, I'm thankful for Dogecoin because I think that it has brought a lot of people to Bitcoin, and I think the fact that you see that and I see that, kind of shows our bent to like, altcoins can be an on ramp to Bitcoin and the space in general, which I think is something that, I think that idea is the reason why this conversation is happening altogether.
Oh, I would agree with you. And it's tricky because there's so much I guess moralizing and qualifying what an on-ramp should look like by people who have already come up that ramp. So at the time Dogecoin was around, there was no way to really reliably go and just pay money off your credit card to regularly dollar cost average into Bitcoin the way the common advice goes now. You had to practice, and you couldn't go spend a bunch of money on GPUs and ASICs to mine Bitcoin because you weren't sure if it was even going to be around in a year or so. So you do it with the practice coin, because at least with something like Dogecoin, you'll have a bunch of fun with it, and it's kind of funny money. And the block reward at the time was like random, so it was driving home the extra point of this is how blockchain stuff works and mining stuff works, but it's also like fun, and it's not meant to be taken too seriously. If you find that you're really, really into it, you're gonna by default already know everything you need to get involved into Bitcoin. So there was a very DIY onboarding culture with people already there willing to point you in the right direction to help you out. And because you have to go mine it yourself, there's a very clear difference between that and what we came to have now, which is people just going and telling you what to buy. Because as soon as it goes from somebody telling you how to get it on your own to telling you what to buy, it opens the door for bad action or misdirection and telling you to buy the wrong thing or telling you to buy like a Bitcoin fork. There's less of a personal investment into understanding what you're acquiring, and you just start shopping for what people tell you to, and it may not be exactly what you should be getting into. So that's a natural part of growth, but that's what I think the Dogecoin cohort was kind of the last onboarding of people who by default understood how to read a block explorer, for example, and understood the difference between a token that's launched on another blockchain or a sovereign blockchain on its own. I think that the people who do that now, they've already bought in, they've already paid tuition in the form of losses in getting scammed rather than just climbing up a learning curve of spending a little time. And that's why I think there's a chip on a lot of people's shoulders to become protectivist against people climbing the on-ramp in ways that might hurt them. And so it's a lot of like white knighting for the new people, thinking like, if we don't give them a cushy on-ramp, like a bumper bowling on-ramp, then we're not going to get them in here. But people are fairly resilient, and they're as intelligent as you give them credit for, I think, in most cases. So it's hard to say. It's not getting worse. It's getting easier for people, but there's got to be a balance between it being so easy that you just get scammed and difficult enough that you have to learn a little bit, but you also, it's learning that you want to do and you see the benefits. So it's definitely gotten harder to advise on how to onboard as the onboarding options have become more numerous and easier for people.
Yeah, I actually really like the way that you frame like there's a lot of ways to onboard into this, and I think that that is completely true, and I think that that's something that a lot of people on like the Bitcoin maximalist side miss out on is like they think like there's a perfect way to onboard, and it has to be protect the noobs from all these bad ways to onboard, all these mistakes and scams that you can get caught up in. And I think that they forget the process of getting to Bitcoin max, like appreciating Bitcoin. Like it's a long process to get to that point. It's just not easy, and everyone has their own path.
Right. And I'll say this for Bitcoin maximalism, the honing of the clarity of the message, especially with respect to onboarding, like that can be a powerful thing, especially for people who they're not really finance or money minded. And no matter how much you tell them about what fractional reserve banking is and what the Fed printing money is and what fiat versus the fixed supply is, they're not going to know or care enough. They just don't want to be left out in the cold if their money should get destroyed in value. It's the type of person that would look to a financial advisor just to give them guidance so that they don't have to stress about it. So for that, giving a clear instruction to just, okay, if you want to get interested in this, no more than 1% of your net income or savings, and only buy a small amount of BTC, Bitcoin, Satoshis every week or every month or whatever your structure is as an investment against the current system not working out in your favor. I think that is a super powerful message, but we shouldn't assume that everybody is at that lowest common denominator level. Like we should allow for people to branch into all possible options that they want, just with an understanding that the risk goes up, and unless you really like risk, and people do, they buy lottery tickets and they go to Vegas, pump the brakes. And harkening back to the whole who is not so fast, the handle I chose was sort of like a reminder to not FOMO into something. Like, hey man, not so fast. Like if you want to buy this trash coin or mine this thing that's not going to go anywhere, like think twice about it. So it became a reminder for me to like not FOMO before FOMO was really a commonly used term in the whole thing.
So I'd like to get your take on the whole DeFi ecosystem, because one of the big bull cases for Ethereum is that every single individual application on Ethereum represents a way to become onboarded, whereas Bitcoin, like what does it mean to Bitcoin? Like it kind of all roads end up like just buying and holding BTC, but on Ethereum, like what does it mean to Ethereum? Could mean anything, because you can go do prediction market stuff, you can go do lending and borrowing, etc. How do you feel that fits into that whole narrative?
Well, the Ethereum thing is fascinating because it's such a bigger, wider at this juncture point of I guess uptake, and I think it's one that people can be more attracted to for that reason if they're not hard finance minded. And I think we're still working out the 2017 ICO hangover for regulatory reasons and everything else. But it's good because it's given kind of a lot more legitimate projects, and you're way more familiar with more of them than I am, just because there's so much more going on that I know about with Ethereum, because I think the dev environment for building stuff on top of it is so much more focused on non-financial stuff and financial stuff. I'm thinking not just about like crypto kitty style gaming and all this other stuff, but about like with all the lending and you know, Dex is built on Ethereum and all that stuff. You can tell I'm much less knowledgeable about the breadth of what's going on with Ethereum as I am with Bitcoin, just because like the Bitcoin financial vector seems to, even though it has a kind of a shifting narrative goal, it stays pretty focused. Whereas the whole thing with Ethereum was attract as many people as we can, use this language to build whatever app you can, and we'll glom it all together and we will push it till it breaks. So you have like lending at rates that are so massively arbitrageable across current legacy markets that you can do some pretty crazy stuff. And it's a young system, so you know, it's still got to be built out with robust oracles so that you can't flash crash and arbitrage across different products that are going on in order to sort of break systems and raid, use the code or inherent aspects of the oracles to raid other funds that are involved in there and sort of take everybody else's money. But it's a whole other animal, and I don't think it should be invalidated just because there's a strong narrative going on with Bitcoin that it's the leader and the primary driver of a new alternate money system that's more robust from the security argument in any case. Like if Bitcoin is going to be, I say this a lot, if Bitcoin's going to be the one fundamental base layer hard money blockchain, you guys are familiar with the Lindy curve of adoption for stuff like that. Ethereum, it gets to travel in Bitcoin's wake, having an easier time right behind it on that Lindy curve, and plenty of other altcoins behind those besides. Some of them may represent scams or scams if the project fails and falls off the Lindy curve, but we have Bitcoin ahead of everything, forging the path. And it's important to note that Bitcoin enables all of the things that some Bitcoiners might call a scam, but are built on its DNA, its open source code or ideas derived from it. So that's kind of where I think Ethereum fits in the space. Like it's super important, as you know, but when you look at it, where everything's traveling along the same path, like Bitcoin's the head of the comet and everything else is in the tail, but still part of the comet. You realize like, oh, the infighting and nitpicking between the two groups, it doesn't have to go as far as it does.
Yeah, that's actually kind of what I wanted to get to.
Yeah,
because there's a conversation that we've had a number of times here on POV Crypto, and I've had plenty of times elsewhere where somebody is coming into the space, especially in 2017, where they come into the space because it's making a bunch of noise, but not necessarily because that noise is at all coherent. And so they're poking their head in and they're saying, what the hell's going on in this place? And then there's like ICOs and tokens and Bitcoin forks and Bitcoin forks of forks. And then there's good ICOs and there's bad ICOs. And so like, especially in times like that, when there's so much noise, when somebody comes in and they step into that world, they don't understand who they are, where their identity is. Whereas now in this bear market, like the Bitcoiner identity has really, really distilled, and the Ethereum identity has really, really distilled. And now it seems, and this was probably true back then too, but now it seems like when you're a newbie stepping into this world, you have a very short amount of time before like the narrative of one ecosystem or the other resonates with you. And then we see people like really gravitate towards either the Bitcoiner end of the spectrum or the Ethereum end of the spectrum. And so like, is this a matter of people's like personality or their ideological leanings is a good question? Or is it something that's just like a happenstance? Like they just read the right Reddit comment first and that made them a Bitcoiner, or that made them an Ethereum. So how do you think about these things?
Oh, wow. It's funny because I see those two things playing out. And without interviewing everybody, like how can we really tell what got them to choose to go on board, and how can we really tell whether somebody started off being into Bitcoin but then realized, oh, this is dumb, all I'm supposed to do is buy satoshis every week, while you 5 years ago bought full bitcoins every week. Like, I'm basically buying your 10 million X. Like, I'm not into that. I think I'm more interested in what's going on in Ethereum. And the same thing is like with, other people could start off with Ethereum and say like, oh, this seems like really disjointed, and everybody's saying decentralization is important, and Infura is super centralized. Maybe Bitcoin is what matters to me. And then there's other people that are like, I don't care about any of this. I don't care about understanding it. But what I do see is opportunities to make money, and lots of people, like a big, vibrant trader community. And so, okay, I'll trade some BTC USD. Okay, I'll trade some Ethereum. Okay, oh, what's Chainlink? I'm going to go trade that. It looks like it's rocketing for the past several months. Like, and they want to validate themselves as a trader. And I know that type well because it fits a very large young male demographic of which I was once part, and I was a trader for like 5 years straight on just the legacy markets. And that's a powerful attractor too. And then there's people who are into code and want to create apps. There's people that are entrepreneurial and want to build stuff on either a Bitcoin based business, or there's people that are into the culture and they just want to find the communities that are the most popular and create Bitcoin printed and Litecoin printed and Ethereum printed socks and sell those, So I don't think though, I think there's a whole other large class of people that wouldn't put one above the other or fit in either one of those camps. And if there's a dichotomy there, like I'm fascinated that your experience is that there is a strong dichotomy, because with mine, it's been that, yeah, those two kind of bright spots exist, but there's a lot of haze in between where a lot of other people are totally fine with playing. And just for that reason, it's hard for me to relate to any kind of maximalist viewpoint, insofar as there's so much evidence that there's a large cooperative space to enjoy and play around in everything while things sort themselves out. And it's clearly going to take a long time, and keep on going, giving opportunities for everybody.
So something that makes me so bullish in BTC in particular, and a lot of that has to do with Bitcoin, being first and just kind of being like the everyone's first love type of a situation. But I see BTC being used outside of community and outside of identification as a Bitcoiner. Like everyone in the crypto space and even outside of the crypto space, like they're using BTC because it's like the reserve currency of the space. Can you kind of talk about in general, like how you see like the money stack that is in the crypto sphere all working together, and like what's your mental model around that?
Okay, well, a lot of people like to say interoperability for all this stuff, and you get talk about atomic swaps, and you get talk about I guess tokenization versus altcoins and all that stuff. I think at the very beginning, by virtue of Bitcoin's open source, and this is something I talk about over and over again because I just think it's like a strong core of how to see the space clearly. There's an argument from open source for altcoins, and that because Bitcoin had to be released open source, otherwise it wouldn't work, because you couldn't check that you were running the same software that gave everybody the equal opportunity to mine the same amount of Bitcoins at the same rate. You gave a window for people to tweak the parameters of Bitcoin or build on that source code and make it better. And part of Bitcoin's strength was, as the first and original blockchain, it encouraged that kind of experimentation. And there were lots of philosophies in the early times, and I guess they still exist today, saying, well, if anything good gets built on an altcoin, Bitcoin will just take it. And that was true for certain technologies like check, lock, time, verify. That opcode was developed on the Viacoin blockchain and then incorporated into Bitcoin as a BIP. And that enables atomic swaps across all blockchains that have that opcode in it, which is like most proof of work blockchains. There's There's also interoperability through markets. And what interoperability through markets does is, in the early stages, it let people make bets. Oh, well, Bitcoin dominance matters. This is how much I think altcoins could, or an altcoin could beat Bitcoin for the top spot. And so it was an early betting platform to just say, like, this is how valid an alternative to Bitcoin could be, either just simple parameter tweak wise or with new technology built on top of it iteratively. There's another vector that arises from that where, yes, the value of Bitcoin is in its fixed supply, but because it has clonable, replicatable open source, there has to be some kind of buffer between that fixed supply and any kind of changes like moving the decimal that you could possibly force through via fork. And maybe that fixed supply and the unit bias of 21 million being too small a number needs some interim short-term blow off via the creation of new coins and new capacity for that. So when I look at the total market capitalization of all cryptocurrencies and tokens in general, I like to think about it as how much is this worth in the total number of Bitcoin? Well, that determines the nexus of supply and demand of how many Bitcoins we would be using right now if there were only Bitcoins and no other altcoins. So I think the last time I looked and made a chart about this was for a talk I did last year, and it was about 30 million Bitcoins. I'm like, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good estimate by Satoshi of how many we would need and use. If we were using all just 30 million Bitcoins at the moment, trading them and mining them back and forth and building all on that, we'd be just fine. We probably wouldn't need all these altcoins and everything. But because the vector with the open sources, there's always going to be created a little more than you originally planned for in your supply cap. That's what we're going to end up using. So it's a natural function of having open source is you're going to get more. And I believe that it's part of Bitcoin, not a competitor, but just a long tail of the phenomenon that Bitcoin created. That's kind of a long-winded way of coming around to what everything is and what everything needs to do. So, we talk about Litecoin being Bitcoin's test net, and that is a totally valid use for something that could be worth, $100 billion market capitalization if Bitcoin is, replaces gold as a store of value and, number goes up as much as we hope it might. That's still a valid use case. And we've seen in a lot of cases where Bitcoin BTC has been under fee attack and network spam attack that lots of stuff goes over to Litecoin. In fact, one of the biggest atomic swap exchanges uses Litecoin as its base currency for its more voluminous pairs, just because the Litecoin blockchain is smaller and easier to sync. And when you're running full nodes of every currency that you want to support for your own trading, it's easiest to do it with Litecoin rather than a Bitcoin node if you want to do it, run a whole bunch of nodes. And of course, all this stuff is very young. When I say voluminous, that exchange doesn't have a ton of volume or anything like that compared to centralized exchanges. But the point is that it's an option, it's growing, and it's one more point of network connectivity that all of these blockchains and tokens living on them, when taken together, represent an ecosystem that can account for more than just the economic hard money that Bitcoin provides us, but also weird stuff and individual stuff like irrational economic action for taste or for community or for project development that could one day be taken up by Bitcoin or Ethereum or a larger network. So the more interoperable it all is, the more chances liquidity and value that creates that liquidity from development, wherever you might want to start with it, can flow through to where the most people can benefit from it.
So I was recently on the Epicenter podcast, which hasn't yet come out, but they were giving me a lot of pushback when I said that the moneyness and money aspect of this crypto revolution will converge onto just one platform. And that's combining the fact that the internet is one single thing, right? There's not multiple internets. There's not separate networks. It's just kind of this one massive coalesced thing. And also money collects where it's allowed to. Like the only reason why we have multiple different currencies for every single nation is because the nation puts up borders. And so it sounds like you think that there's going to be just this mesh network of interconnected blockchains that are all talking to each other and exchanging value with each other. Is it, if that's not your opinion, let me know. But if it is, why do you think it won't converge?
Well, there's a chance that it will converge, and that that sort of interconnected network will remain like a very small subgroup. Whether that small subgroup is 0.1% of the entire new definition of money that blockchains have created, or whether it's like 2%, or whether it's like 25%. I'm not sure exactly where it'll end up, but there are a few factors that push it away from it being just one. One is the open source that I mentioned. There's virtually no barrier to attempting to create a new network, and there's really no barrier to creating a token and then attempting to ascribe value to it experimentally and iteratively. So that vector is always going to be increasing the number of alternative networks that there are. Those also die off, and that's a decreasing factor. But I would argue that as long as effort can be put forth into an area where someone making that effort could receive outsized gains for it, I think the growth will always trump the natural decline of that portion. Then there's the whole speculative aspect of it, especially that well, definitely before 2017 in the regulatory crackdown was it was relatively unfettered and free, and people, many of whom had no business doing so from a risk perspective, could still jump in and speculate. And that's kind of a leap of technology that we don't give a lot of credit because of scams and everything else. But the freedom to speculate, like, that's a fairly high-end economic activity. And even though it's abstracted by some weird technology that someone may or may not understand, it's a freedom that suddenly a lot of people who didn't have now had it. So there's a few vectors that will keep the morass of new coin creation and death and speculation on multiple assets and creation of everything. You can call Bitcoin like the internet, and I think that's a valid comparison. But it also shares aspects of other networks, like networks of groups of friends. Like, there isn't just one group of friends. You have multiple social circles, and I think that could represent certain aspects of different blockchains and different cryptocurrencies. There's not just one way that networks are, and the internet is a great example because it is towards the centralized end of having a single power, and it's an easy example to go to when it supports the case for one single blockchain being the most relevant in the future. And network effects do work like that. There's a pull to the greatest one, but there's also, as I explained, the vectors that pull you to create new ones. If the interoperability is high and speculation ensures that market interoperability by trading remains high, then I don't think there's an incentive for those things to go away.
Sorry.
I keep running you on a diatribe, and then I stop talking, and I'm like, should I have stopped?
No, that was great. That was great, and I think you explained it pretty realistically of like those factors and why you see even if, one or two of these, big cryptos is really dominant as money, why the altcoin ecosystem isn't going to die off. I guess where I'd like to kind of just turn the conversation a little bit is talking about you as a spec miner, because I actually think like that's probably, what at least got you in front of me and probably, really built up your audience, especially earlier on. Can you talk about like what is changing with spec mining? And, as a side note, like, do you see spec staking as something that it could fill that void?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. And I have to preface it by saying that the way I liked to spec mine, which was with new proof of work launches that would go to market, it got pretty much fully cannibalized by the ability to the widespread knowledge that, oh, you can just create a token on Ethereum for your venture slash scam and do it that way rather than have to rally a whole bunch of miners. And so miners were essentially cut out of the sort of piggybacking on the profiteering part of the whole token launch ecosystem. That's still happening. However, there is a spec mining vector where, but it's mostly, it's far more sparse. Most of the proof of work spec mineable currencies you probably haven't heard of and won't hear of until they've been running for a good 6 to 12 months. Certain exceptions being stuff like Grin and its Mimblewimble ilk, because they're a little more popular at the beginning before they go mainnet. But you see a lot of people building new types of proof of work, whether they're trying to speed up the network propagation ability, whether they're trying to build it in new computing languages, whether they're trying to build an architecture that mines, I think it's 2 to the 64 small blockchains at once. That one just released, I think, 24 hours ago. There's a lot of experimentation at the bleeding edge of code, and some of this, a lot of this dies off. But for miners who are interested in contributing to these networks, to sort of battle test them in their 0.1 phase, if they do continue to mine and reach an exchange and people decide to speculate on them, and that sort of upward spiral allows them to profit at the end of it when this does become an actual ongoing venture and workable altcoin chain that has non-zero value. There is still value in the spec mining there, but it takes a lot more chops than just running a miner with a specific algo on your GPUs. Also, mining has industrialized in a big way. ASICs have become widespread, and there isn't a lot of alpha you can capture from mining in your basement on your own electricity anymore. Most important to this has been the uptake of miners looking to all over the world to find the cheapest or waste electricity they can find, and that sort of immediately outcompetes anybody mining at their home retail electricity rates with a smaller amount of equipment, just by virtue of those miners' cost basis being so much smaller than yours. They can dump any market that emerges down to a price below your own break even. And so that makes it a little hard to do. We do see already certain kinds of spec staking. There have been a lot of altcoins that use proof of work as their initial distribution method, and then they go either hybrid proof of work, proof of stake, and sometimes that looks like one block goes to proof of work, then one to proof of stake, and then they trade off forever. Or sometimes it's an algorithmic competition where you'll pop a few on staking and pop a few on proof of work. And it's a lot harder to attack those small networks, because even if you can 51% attack the hash rate, you also have to have a sufficient stake to grind out a stake attack against it. So you can really only roll those back a few blocks before attacking them. So there is a lot of potential in the proof of stake world. And though Ethereum is trying to do it its own way, proof of stake has been working fairly well on a lot of smaller blockchains for a long time, especially supported by hybrid proof of work. There have been a few that have succumbed to Sybil attacks, and those are pretty obvious because they just get dumped to oblivion. Like the buy side evaporates. It never has that been more prominent than in this kind of cryptocurrency, well, altcoin bear market that's been going since the ICO hangover. But there's did that speak properly to what you were saying about kind of spec staking, or was there another angle of that I didn't quite get?
Well, I don't really know anything about spec staking, and clearly you know way more about spec mining than I do. But I was just curious, like, if it's too difficult to mine now, like obviously the point of staking for a lot of people is to make it accessible to the normal user again. So I was curious if that was an avenue that was developing.
Yeah, well, it is. There's a lot of I mean, I just so you know that I'm not being like coin partisan or anything like this, I'll just name drop like a few things that you have, like Atom delegated staking and Tezos delegated baking, where you get it's not super decentralized, but basically larger entities agree to abide by delegate rules, and then they kind of hold your coins in escrow, but you still retain the keys to those and everything, and they stake them for you. It's just a way to kill down the noise of the blockchain, so that staking by validators happens smoothly by sufficiently powered computing networks or staking nodes, and that way it doesn't all fall apart. It's a little less elegant than the small Bitcoin node with massive hard drive on it, but it can allow for a few more things that inbuilt to those blockchains that that Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have right in it right away. But yeah, staking works. The popular, I guess, gripe about it is that it's broken and it's centralized and it's vulnerable to Sybil, but it was actually, all that stuff was solved by Douglas Pike on Vericoin in about 2015. You run a second blockchain for it. It's just everybody ignored the solution because it wasn't really speculatable upon. Vericoin had been mostly mined out at that point by its proof of work distribution. So those papers are still around. They're an interesting read. I don't think anybody has bothered to poke holes in them yet. Maybe it's because they haven't been interested to, but I really think, proof of stake was solved 5 years ago. And I'm sure I'm not the foremost expert. There's somebody who could look at those papers and harumph and tell me differently, but and until someone does, it looks like it makes sense to me. I'm looking at a staking machine now. I've got 15 different coin wallets open and staking, and they've been going for years.
So one of the things that makes me so bullish about proof of stake is that the low cost of validating the chain, which is what proof of stake is optimizing for, right? It's optimizing for having a low cost of security, which means that the stakers don't actually have to sell the rewards that they get from their earnings, from their validation, which means that they get to hoard, which means that they get to they're rewarded for their bullishness. And so they don't actually have to sell their coins from the cost of staking. Whereas with Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin miners have to sell the coins. Like they must sell the coins. Bitcoiners would say that this is a feature because it's a distribution mechanism, and the real stake is actually in the mining hardware and the mining facility, which guarantees alignment with the network. And that's not something that proof of stake has. How do you think about these things with regards to alignment, incentive, and security mechanisms? Like, do you have opinions on this?
Yeah, like you got it exactly right. Like, it's just two different ways of incentivizing distribution and also abstracting away the stake. Like for proof of work, the stake is abstracted away to physical equipment, and there are pluses and minuses to that. One big plus to Bitcoin in the early days, and the early days of proof of work for any new launch altcoin, was that if you had a GPU in your gaming rig already, that's sunk cost. You didn't have to do much other than point that rig and power at a blockchain network to earn a different kind of reward from it, other than the enjoyment you would have gaming. And the flip to that is the arms race for that squeezes out so that mining becomes more for the industrialized entrepreneur who's willing to take on a lot more risk than just using the GPU they already had in their system. Conversely, proof of stake, there's a lot of conjecture that it's vulnerable to cascade failure, where if someone sees the market dumping, they're going to withdraw their stake and dump it on the market too. And there's a lot of weird narrative stuff going on because I feel like it's really highly unexamined. You may remember the sort of masternode craze that happened alongside the ICO craze, and that has died down a fair amount. But all the criticisms levied against masternodes, there's a common thing saying, "Oh, your coins are locked in a masternode." They're never locked. Like, you can move those coins as if they were sitting in a wallet.
The right word was deposited.
Yeah, deposited is a much better word, but people always said locked, and they're not. And yet you don't see cascade failure on something like Dash, the original masternode network. There's a lot of value in continuing to support an elevated node long term. And just because those coins are movable doesn't mean that there's a sunk mental cost to contributing a desire to anchor one's take to the inflation rate rather than keep them on an exchange or use those coins for spending or anything else. Like, I think the abstraction with staking doesn't get enough credit just because it is with all the same achieving a proof of work where the work is subsumed in a battery of coins that are being held deliberately and prevented from spending. I don't think are there drawbacks to it? Sure. But compared to proof of work, absolutely so. But they're two methods, and neither has failed conclusively. Rather, so far, they're both conclusively successful until proven otherwise.
So tell me if you agree or disagree with this statement.
Yeah.
Staking is made possible because Bitcoin exists.
In an indirect way, I totally agree. I'm not sure which was the first cryptocurrency to implement proof of stake. I think it was Hobo Nickels or something silly like that, which is still around, I believe. But it's a natural progression from thinking, well, is there a way to do this with less energy, and what can we do? Where can we derive work or a battery of work, or a representation or a suitable proxy of work, so that we can derive an incontrovertible software hashing proof that will allow us to secure a blockchain, if not from proof of burning energy. So yeah, I think proof of stake is, if not for Bitcoin, proof of stake, it might have been come to in another way, but definitely is a direct descendant.
Christian, how is anything not a result of Bitcoin? Like, at the end of the day, you can always have that road roll back right to Bitcoin.
I mean, that's of course true, but I guess to piggyback on that is, I'm just trying to think, like, is proof of work something that, like, Andreas says it here. I'm sorry. Andreas says this all the time, but he says that, like, there may only be room for one proof of work chain, but then there's all this other stuff to kind of build on top of that distributed proof of work that they can anchor on as the, like, that kind of real rock. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's important for like altcoin people that kind of wish the flippening to understand that Bitcoin does help, these experimentations and the kind of like furthering of this cause. On the flip side, it's important for Bitcoiners to understand that, like, now that Bitcoin is here, you can do other stuff. Like, other stuff doesn't necessarily take away from Bitcoin. Like, it can actually add to Bitcoin. And I think you and I agree. Like, I say that all of this space is Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree that if you take a holistic viewpoint to what Bitcoin is, like the most expansive you can, you realize that Bitcoin, despite experiments with hash cash and e-gold and whatever came before it, Bitcoin was the first success that enabled everything else to exist. And I think just mentally, the thing that, and I hate to lump them all together, but a lot of Bitcoiners go through is they believed and then they were validated by the marketplace. But during the period before that validation, they had to endure a lot of cloned and slightly tweaked copies of their original source that they held almost sacred. And I would say definitely some people hold it sacred now. Um, Entering into direct competition just by tweaking a number with a fairly obvious subtext of, if this works, then I'm going to get rich and Bitcoin's going to die. And so that those seeds of initial unfair competition, I think they put a psychological imprint on the Bitcoiner collective psyche. And a lot of them are still arguing against arguments that are, threats that are long since dead. Nobody really thinks that another altcoin is going to overtake Bitcoin just because it's better and it's got better parameters, or it's a fork of BTC that's better for this reason or that reason. The first mover advantage, I would highly doubt if it's ever going to change away from BTC. Little tiny ridiculous permissionless market blips notwithstanding. There's all the talk of a flippening because it's a meme, because it gives us one silly data point for us to look back and say, aha, Bitcoin wasn't top dog anymore. And that's all it's for. Like, we know that that condition, A, wouldn't be sustainable, and B, would represent a whole lot worse set of problems than we have now, and negative valuation for the entire blockchain space. With that said, are there threats that could take Bitcoin out? And if it were taken out, something else would take its place? Potentially. I think there's a state effort to allow exchanges to amass, or known individuals to amass large amounts of Bitcoin, and an attempt to co-opt and control as much of the supply and as much of the trading as can be done via fiatification of Bitcoin by offering ETFs and derivatives rather than trading spot, and centralizing of people's Bitcoin to centralized exchanges and attaching it to identity, so that once it becomes easy to go back, cheaper and easier to go back through chain analysis, there's an indelible record of everyone's, untaxed transgressions against whatever state has managed to wrest control away of the larger amount of Bitcoin supply. Stablecoins are another sort of fiatification of Bitcoin. So I think those are threats for Bitcoin being a replacement to everything else. And if you have unlimited fiat printing ability, you can attack a limited supply market, market manipulated. And when I say manipulated, I mean just the exponential number go up can't happen when you have an unlimited fiat and instruments, markets denominated in that fiat to keep the number from going up. That's, I think, the main long-term threat to Bitcoin that I still believe is even somewhat valid. Other ones aren't. You can't quash the Bitcoin network. There's so much resiliency for people to using money. They will boot up solar-powered smartphones that run as nodes. They will boot up mesh networks. They will do whatever has to be done to run a Bitcoin network through LoRaWAN and other like super wide, low power networking. And user in Toronto, NVK, even sent Bitcoin transactions over the radio waves. So, I mean, try and stop it. You know, you can't really. That was a big tangent. I'm sorry. Oh, muted again.
We definitely don't want we don't want to have to learn how to use ham radios to send Bitcoin transactions. I like sending them just the way
it's
I do
not
right
an
now.
ideal case. It's not an ideal case. But the fact that it's possible shows that, like, even if you make the internet illegal, money and the movement of it is important enough that people will easily do an end run around it. You can't
Yeah.
make the technology illegal because there's too much old tech out there that fits a Bitcoin node and allows it to run. It's an incentivized network, and thus it's the most resilient network that we will have ever at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that Bitcoin node on old smartphones is not that far away.
Yep.
But in general, I guess if we were to bring this back to like a last question,
Yeah.
if Bitcoin were to go down, you have a very like extensive understanding of like what other alternative consensus mechanisms are out there. We know a lot of Decred people that think that hybrid proof of work, proof of stake is something that's head and shoulders above the rest. Like, what are you seeing out there, and what could be that other chain? Is it going to be Ethereum, like something that's pure proof of stake and established? Like, what could be an alternative if something were to take down Bitcoin?
If like, it's hard for me to take pot shots at Bitcoin by picking its successor like that. Just there's such a wide variety of options. I would have to know, like, I would have to start off with what took Bitcoin down before I could pick its replacement. So, if there were a massive sort of coordinated state crackdown, libertarians' worst nightmare, making it illegal to own Bitcoin, and your transaction history is directly representative of your sins against the state for which you owe remuneration and taxes, then it would probably be a system where that ran really light, and all transactions were anonymous, and it would be battle tested. So it could be something like Monero or Decred with their anonymization factors in there. Ethereum has its own properly working anonymization protocol. It's just not super widespread yet. So something like that could work. If it were something like a massive black swan with a power outage, it would probably still be a similar proof of work chain to Bitcoin, just one that did not have such widespread ASIC propagation. So it might be one that ran on GPUs still, or it might be one that ran on smaller ASICs, like could even be Litecoin. This is all just so speculative that it's better to think of it as Bitcoin having so many different potential fail safes should something ever get knocked out, that that even if it were the case, quantum's another really good one. So there's I had a lot of discussions on this, I think middle of last year, due to the just analyzing the quantum threat and its ability to break SHA-256 hashes. There's already a failsafe for that, and the edge case for all of Bitcoin's cryptography being irrevocably broken is, before that happens, the people at QRL, that's another blockchain, would be able to snapshot Bitcoin's blockchain regularly and roll it back as the token on QRL and redistribute it to every Bitcoin user. You know, it's a pretty hairy thing to imagine happening, but if the quantum race, there's some, I guess, strategic lack of disclosure within the development race, and someone is able to break cryptography with quantum computing, and they target Bitcoin, and they do succeed in breaking it, visible by like a massive double spend or a rating of private keys associated with like the BitMEX insurance account or something like that. there's already a safety net for it that exists out in the wild and would be probably quantum secure enough for Bitcoin itself to keep going. So yeah, there's not much that can take Bitcoin down.
Aliens.
They got us. I have no experience with them. They got us for sure.
Not so fast. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate your time coming on POV Crypto. Christian, before I ask him to sign off, do you have any last questions?
No, I'm good.
All right.
Yeah, thanks so much for the chat, guys.
Absolutely. If people want to find out more about you, I know you're pseudo anonymous, so there's not much to find there, but where should they go?
There's just my Twitter handle at not so fast and my plethora of past tweets.
Very cool. All right, everyone, you can find the show at POV CryptoPod. You can find me at CK_snarks.
You can find me at Trustless State, both on Twitter and on Bankless. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
That was a great talk.